All right. Hello, my name is Matthew Mawini, and I teach in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics and here at FSU. Thank you all for attending this special event, which is the first of 3 book chats in a lecture series on attention. Please make note of the 2 other upcoming lectures right there on the slide. Today's event would not be possible without the generous support of the Winthrop King Institute and the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Fritz Breithaupt is Provost Professor at Indiana University in Bloomington and teaches in Cognitive Science and Germanic Studies. Fritz has published widely on empathy, narrative cognition, intellectual history, and German and European literature. His latest book is The Dark Sides of Empathy, published by Cornell University Press in 2019. The book discusses the many negative forms of behavior that can be motivated by empathy, from vampirism to polarization. He founded and directs the Experimental Humanities Laboratory at Indiana University to study narratives and narrative thinking empirically, a subject he explores in his forthcoming book on the narrative mind. Previous books focus on empathy, excuse-making, the intellectual history of selfhood, and the German author Goethe. He is also a frequent contributor to the press, especially Die Zeit in Germany, with many dozen articles. And there will be a Q&A session after the lecture, but if you have a question, just please put in the chat box, I have a question, and you will be called on accordingly. All right.
Great. Well, wonderful. Thank you very much. I can put myself on speaker view here. So thank you, Matt, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you for having me. As I already mentioned, I mean, it's very sad in this case for me not to be there. I'm a big fan of FSU and of Tallahassee. So this would be a great occasion to bring the conversation, to extend it, to make it a dialogue and hear how whatever ideas I may present here could intersect with things that you're doing. So I hope that at some point in the not so far future, I will be back in Tallahassee and we can continue the discussion here. For today, I brought a PowerPoint presentation here, so I will be hiding myself on the side here. That helps us to get kind of through the things here. So in that sense, you can orient yourself with that. Not really sure whether PowerPoints are the best way to go or not, but yeah, let's do it this way here today. So I will talk about the dark sides of empathy. Indeed, it is a book talk series. So I have published a book with that name in English in 2019. The German version suffered a strange fortune in Germany. It came out on the day of the inauguration of Donald Trump, which was interesting because I had written about Donald Trump based on the primaries. When he was one of many candidates, and had said, yeah, this guy is probably winning the presidency, which at that point was a far-fetched kind of guess. And then, of course, he actually becomes president. I called him the master of empathy because he's so good in drawing empathy to himself. I mean, attention, by polarizing, by positioning him against everyone else. And that has propelled this book into the world quite a lot. I think every German journalist, that would happen to be the first book on Donald Trump coming out on the inauguration. Very strange fate for humanities scholars that I am to suddenly be in the spotlight with something on that level. But, oops, out of some reason it doesn't want to move forward. Today, I want to talk about what is empathy? How does it work? How can people in the humanities engage with this concept? And then, of course, what are the dark sides of empathy? I should tell you a little bit here about, or preface this by saying that I believe that humanities scholars actually know a lot about empathy. When I started to become interested in empathy, identification, transportation, and all of these kind of things, I noticed that the psychologists have a fairly narrow, at that point, had a fairly narrow view of what empathy is, like the paying close attention to one other human being. And it was kind of a very kind of thing, like it was more like a general ability. We have empathy. And then now that has certain effects and is good and so on and needs certain brain regions. But they did not pay attention to when we use it, in which circumstances, how we channel it, and all of that. And that is something where I would feel like that literature scholars and also scholars of other arts know much more about. Because we see in literary texts how attention becomes focused, how we are getting a clear situation. Literary situations, narrative situations tend to be much more clear than real life situations. And that process of clarification is something we can observe. And that's basically the origin of aesthetics. The word aesthetics was coined in the 18th century to describe clear perceptions, clear attention, purified attention. So in that sense, I want to encourage all of you here, and I assume that many of you, maybe all of you, are in a more arts and humanities related field to say, well, you might be more experts on empathy than many other people. We have access to examining what happens in specific works and how it affects different facets of identity and selfhood and relating to others at the same time. So that is just like my general encouragement of that. So in the context here of the series of attention, so thank you very much, Matt and Michaela, for putting this together. Thank you also for Christian, who I do not know which role he played in the background, but I know that he played some role in it too here to have me here. In the role of a series on attention, I will focus on one specific form of attention, namely the form of paying attention to others, to other human beings. Here you see my son and my nephew playing. I'm not sure whether they really were paying attention to each other, but the picture kind of seemed to illustrate that a little bit. So now I just said that empathy could be seen as a mode of sustained attention or paying attention. But the first thing that I have to clarify is it's not one mode, it's at least four. And I will talk about these different modes of empathy. There's not one form of empathy, there's at least, empathy is an umbrella term, but four, and each of them have their own kind of strengths and weaknesses. So the first notion of empathy is one that comes from a couple of fields. One is social psychology, the other one is evolutionary biology, that is focused on caring for others. Empathic care is one of the core notions that's used, or altruism, of paying attention to others and seeing their needs. There's another form of empathy that's often called theory of mind, which means that we create a theory of the mind of someone else. We understand that someone else is in a different situation than we. They may be happy, we may not be happy, and so on and so on. And their situations are different from others. So that is called having this theory of that. Another way of putting that is that there's a form of empathy that's based on accurate understanding, or an attempt to be accurate in understanding what is going on in the mind of someone else, understanding the feelings of others, their states, their wishes. The third form of empathy comes from the neurosciences, and that is based on sharing emotions. We know that when we observe someone who has a strong emotion, feels fear, then the observer will activate the same patterns in her brain as the one that she observes, reflecting the same pattern now. That's measurable now in brain scanners and so on. And that is actually what neuroscientists call empathy, this intense, immediate sharing of certain emotions. It doesn't work for all emotions. And for some emotions, it would be strange to share them. If you observe someone who loves someone else, if you now immediately fall in love too, that might not be that good. But it works for many of the basic emotions and some others too, including some social emotions like embarrassment too. And then there's a fourth definition, and this is more my own one here, which is the co-experience of the situation of another. That is a concept that is based on the idea that when we have empathy, we actually use the mobility of our consciousness to place our mind into the shoes of someone else and go through the experiences that they have. This is something that fiction readers will find very natural. When we read fiction, we do this, but it also happens in everyday life all the time. Someone tells us what just happened to them, or we observe what's happening to them, and we go through the same experience. This is pretty amazing, actually, because it means that we are not locked into our own kind of little space. We are connected with others. We share experience. We are more than just one self. We are more than we are ourselves, because we have this ability to share experiences and to be connected in making those same experiences. And it's of course beneficial too. I mean, it's not, we don't have to make all the dumb mistakes of others. We learn from the mistakes because we've made that experience. When we read about something dumb that someone did or something that didn't work out, well, something sticks with us. We can feel embarrassed about something that we see other people doing. And we have that experience now. We don't want to do the same thing. Those four notions that I gave you here are seen typically as the typical kind of a fairly good range of these notions of empathy. There's more. They're really like an umbrella of these things. So some people now say we should really not call these things empathy any longer and really split up these four. But quite often when one starts, then the others get engaged too. So they do actually mesh with each other, they overlap, and so on and so on. But just to be clear about that point, that they also can be independent, we do know that the second and third on this list, the theory of mind and the sharing of emotions, activate very different neural connections and patterns in the brain here of activations. There's actually really no overlap. They're separate. Understanding the feelings of someone else and sharing the feelings of someone else is different. It's by even though they often come together, in principle, they are separate abilities here. So based on these four definitions of empathy, we also come now to different forms of attention that go along with this. And this is an important point here, because each of these forms of empathy directs us to pay attention to different aspects. The first notion here from social psychology or evolutionary biology focuses on the needs of others. So people who are very strong on that side of the empathic care side, they will see other human beings and observe them for what do they need? Are they suffering? Is there something to help them with? What is their context that is potentially troubling? People who will pay attention to the theory of mind, the second of these notions here, will pay attention to, in general, just inner states of other people, motivations. Why are they doing this? What's going on with them? What's their goals and so on? In the model of the neurosciences focuses on strong emotions that we pay attention to and neglects some of the other aspects. And the fourth definition of co-experiencing phenomenology focuses on events that we can experience. So each of these ways of looking, of having empathy, is a way to focus our attention and direct it at other people. And this goes both ways. On the one side, there's people who are more prone to the one or the other mechanism here, and so they will see those things more in the world. They will observe the social world and see either the needs of others or the inner states or the emotions or the experiences that will register to them. At the same time, when we encounter, as most people of us have the abilities for all of these, when we encounter the one or the other aspect here, a situation of suffering or a situation of an event that we observe, it probably activates, we don't know all that much about it, but it's more likely to activate that mechanism of empathy that corresponds to that trigger that we are getting here. So that's, so it's a very rich palette here of how we pay attention to the world and how we organize our experiences along that way, or sensations of how we make sense of that. So that's kind of my starting point here. I should also say maybe one more thing on the general side here, which is that empathy is not just like a little sidekick for us as human beings, not just like one of our many features. There's quite a few evolutionary biologists now who suggest that the human brain developed the way that it developed to have empathy. We don't need this large brain for making tools. We could get away with a smaller brain, people suggest. Even the social brain in general doesn't need all of the brain power that we have. It is only this possibility for empathy, for meaning, that we can have our own consciousness, but also accept the consciousness of others, that we need such a large and complex brain as we have it. This is an argument that Michael Tomasello and other people in that field of human evolutionary biology have made. So empathy defines us. This is a powerful thought. And in narratives and literature and the arts, we might see in a way the most ideal form of that kind of form of empathy, or some people call it an transportation, where you're transported into a world of fiction. So empathy, at least, of course, I work on empathy, so I see empathy everywhere, and of course I say it's very important, but at least there seems to be some interesting support for the idea that when considering empathy, we're dealing with important aspects here. So what I want to direct us now is to look at empathy and its biases, what kind of how we see the world because we have so much empathy, and where this leads us to missteps. So there's a couple of, and also we should also understand that people often make assumptions about empathy that I will ultimately try to say that are incorrect here. So there's three assumptions of empathy that I want to challenge. The first one is that empathy is a special form of observation of two people, an observer and observed. I will introduce the figure of a third person in it. I think it's a more complex setting in many cases, not all cases. A second assumption that is often made is that empathy is good for conflict resolution. If we only had more empathy, there would be fewer conflicts. And that's, I think, is problematic. And then the third aspect that I want to also at least question is the point that empathy is usually good for the recipient of empathy. I will be a little bit more, well, less idealistic, and will say empathy is good for the empathizer, first of all. Whether the other person benefits, we shall see. That is open. Now, I'm saying all of these kind of things, and of course I will talk about the dark sides of empathy, with one caveat, which is that ultimately I think that empathy is important. It defines us, and is also in many cases good. If you want to talk about good and bad, yes, there's a lot of bright spots. If there's a question about this, I would rather have more than less empathy, but that doesn't mean that it automatically would make our world better or good in some sense. It's much more complicated. There's many areas where empathy misfires, and that's what I'll talk about. And what I will do today then is I'll do two things. I will introduce you to my model of empathy, which I call the trigger theory of empathy, that allows you to see how this might also work, especially well for narrative sequences, including in literature. And then we'll talk about the dark sides of empathy. The dark sides will actually follow quite neatly from the first part. So the dark sides I can just kind of snip, and then basically each time you will suddenly say, oh yeah, I see it now. At least that's the hope. If I do my work here well, that you can follow me, then that's how it should happen. So my starting point here for my model of empathy is really to say we're dealing with a trigger model. And oh, by the way, this is kind of, I feel it's like, if someone wants clarifications in between, just speak. I don't mind to be interrupted whatsoever. So if there's something that's unclear or so that's should be addressed right away, just jump in here. Very happy to give an example or go over it or so, stuff like that. You don't have to hold back to the end. We are in a family here of the modern languages. So to come to my model, I want to say that for me, empathy is not just like this general thing that we have, some kind of brain thing or so. It is something that will turn on and off. We don't always have it. And that's important that we don't always have it. So empathy can be used selectively. And that's the basis for this model here, to understand when do we use it, when do we not use it, and when is it good that we don't use it too. I mean, it's not like a good, bad question in the case here. So my starting point is to say, well, human beings actually have a lot of capacities for empathy, and these four different definitions that I showed you here for empathy indicate already that, yeah, there's lots of ways how we can have empathy. We are in a way hyper empathetic. We can relate to some odd objects. There's studies done in Germany 100 years ago when they came up with this modern notion of empathy, or Einfühlung, this feeling into yourself, where they took like objects. They would kind of say, yes, I can have this feeling in Einfühlung with the dead objects. And neuroscientists today can actually show that our brain fires in response to this. This uprightness is something that we respond to in a certain way, and similar to empathy. It definitely does work that way, even on the metaphorical way that it lifts you up suddenly and you become 3 inches taller. Which is pretty impressive in a certain way. Yeah. So we have a lot of ways we were being empathic, and it affects us. But because of that, and I don't go through all of these examples here, but because of that, we also that also can go too far. Because we are hyper empathetic, we can also empathize where we shouldn't necessarily empathize. So here's already, you can see already a little luring of the bad side here. We can lose ourselves in the process. An interesting aspect of us is that our center of gravity of our consciousness seems to be in one place only at a time. So in that way, when we empathize with others, not in all forms of empathy, but in some of them, we are going over to someone else. We are giving in to the personality of someone else who can take over. And this can lead to self-loss. The most extreme case, or one of them, maybe not even the most extreme case, but a very extreme case of that is Stockholm syndrome, hostage identification syndrome, where hostages in a life and death situation may over-identify with the hostage takers, adopt their desires, their goals, and completely leave their self behind in the process, destroy their self, and then battle on the side of the hostage taker. So in the original Stockholm case, that was actually quite striking, where the hostages battled along these 2 people who held up the bank, even after the police was already peacefully overrun. The hostages kept on fighting against the police on their own. And one of them then famously fell in love with one of the hostage takers who was in jail. So there was something in that they couldn't control it. Empathy had just gone too far in that extreme situation. Luckily, that is rare, but this kind of idea of selfless, this form of going too far, occurs probably in milder forms, in many forms of hierarchical relationships. The boss, the captain in the army, in the boot camp, graduate school supposedly can also lead to that. Traditional marriage might have some aspects of that too, where one takes over and the others lose part of their self in the process. That's the negative side. There's the positive side of living more than one life. When we read books, we also lose ourselves, but it's a happy thing. But because of this, and this is what I'm getting to in the terms of the architecture here, on the one side, we have a lot of abilities for empathy. We're hyper empathetic. But because of that, we also need to block it, limit it, channel it. I mean, we need to control it to not always have empathy with everyone in every situation. And that is something that we can measure on many levels, where people are selective. So one of the famous studies about the difference between males and females is that in most respects, males and females on the brain activity pattern cannot clearly be differentiated. If a brain scientist gets only data about empathy activation, they could not tell whether it's a male or female brain. As far as I know, they may have reached that threshold now, but so far it always looks the same, except in a few cases. And one of the wonderful few exceptions is one that involves blocking empathy. This is when, in an experiment done in 2006 for the first time and confirmed since, participants were watching the punishment in a video. By the way, in a brain scanner, they were watching the punishment of someone who had cheated in a game previously. And now they got, in this little video, they got electroshocks for their bad behavior. In that case, that was the only case that people had found until then. And also, well, there's a couple of more cases, but there was the first case where there was the first time a difference between male and female reaction, where the females still had empathy for the wrongdoer who was punished. They suffered with him. I think it was a him. But reduced. It was like half level, whatever. I mean, whatever the reduced meant. They still felt empathy for the pain of that wrongdoer. The males, however, in the brain scanner felt delight. They liked the punishment. There was nothing like empathy in it. This was just the joy and reward center of the brain was lighting up. Yes, 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 I want this. That was one of the few occasions of a difference here, which is interesting in itself. For me, what is interesting here is that apparently, males and females in the study suppress empathy in the case when they feel like this is, well, fair punishment. And the males suppressed it even more than the females on average here. Significantly more, dramatically more, actually. But that is one of the many cases where people automatically, without thinking much about it, just have fewer empathy. There's other cases like unfair players, but it's also when when we feel people get too much money for certain things. There's studies that show that you have less empathy with people who get overcompensated for doing something like that, rich people. Then, of course, there's enemies, competitors, out-group members, where immediately people very strongly favor the people from the in-group. They don't relate to the suffering and pain from people who are different from themselves. There's definitely a empathy group bias involved here, which can be described as a blocking. It just doesn't come through. And now the final step of my architecture is a very simple architecture here is that, hey, we have these abilities. We usually block it. In most cases, we do not have empathy. But then there's a couple of cases where we nevertheless admit empathy. They're selective triggers, I call them. And I want to talk about these triggers here. You don't have to read the slides. There's too many words on it, way too complicated. We are more likely to allow empathy in some situations, like when it's a clear situation, and when there's strong emotions involved, and in case of side taking and so on. And I will actually run you through these examples here, just to give you a quick sense. And anyone who has ever opened my book sees that I do some funny doodling in it and stuff like that. And that's the funnest part of writing a book is when you can do your own doodles in it. So I always recommend that. I mean, write your books. I know that Michaela has a fantastic book right now in review. We'll hope, knocking on wood, that it will be published very quickly here. We want to see it. And for all the others who are also writing books, do a little bit of doodling. I recommend it. I mean, I got more comments on my silly little sketches than on probably any other aspect. Maybe Donald Trump accepted from that book. Yes, I did get comments on Donald Trump. Well, some other things too. But anyway, so here we see the eye on the lower side is the observer. That hoop blocks with this little wall in the middle, who blocks empathy in most cases for the other person. The other person, not necessarily someone who looks very sweet or nice or so, but well, we can block it, we can have empathy. So the question is, when do we have empathy? And if there is a threshold of a block, then sometimes it can be, and I just go through this briefly, we can bypass this block. We are maybe not prepared for certain things. We expect this person to behave in a certain way that we block, but now something different happens. The person surprises us, and then we say, oh, okay, now suddenly I have to focus on this person. I pay attention because it's unusual. And then I can actually relate to this person. There can be what I call the breaking through of the block, meaning the other side has strong emotions. There's something so powerful that I just have to react. The situation of the other is not blockable for me. It has to haunt me. It has to affect me. There's also something in the go through this briefly here that I call tunneling, is that while we block empathy in most cases, there's some aspects that are culturally sanctioned where we will all say, oh, now we have to have empathy. I mean, this is the child in need. In our American, Western European culture that I grew up in, when there's a child crying of a certain age, we just it's normal that we all pay attention. And then you develop empathy, you pity them, but it's also you develop empathy. It's culturally sanctioned. So there's some things that we exclude from the blocking. We just know it's a proper thing to do. So now comes the first one that I want to surprise you with. And there's two that I hope to at least offer you something interesting here. We are also more likely to admit empathy when we know that we get to end our engagement with the other person. We are more likely to pay attention to the other if we know we will afterwards be able to return to ourselves. And I use this metaphorically here, this self-loss and the return to the self, but it does correspond to our phenomenological self-perception, that we have moved the center of our gravity to someone else. When you read a book, you can really observe the world through the eyes of that character. And in real life too, you really suddenly understand what someone is going through. Now we are held hostage in that process. That is an exhausting process that comes with dangers. If you have empathy with someone else, they may have demands on you, on all kinds of things. They might exploit you. Empathy is very exploitable. It's not only marketing people know. So what I'm suggesting here is that we are more likely to have empathy if we know it will come to an end. And this is something very exciting that happens in literature and fiction. Fiction comes with a contract to the readers. And that contract involves a lot of things, but one of the key things is that it promises you that it will take you into some kind of adventure of some sort, or some kind of inner voyage, but then it will go through a narrative sequence of events and then release you. It will end. A story, as Aristotle put it, I mean, in the case of drama, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when I remember when I was a student, I read that, I thought, yeah, that's pretty dumb. It has a beginning, middle, and end. But no, it's actually, I was probably the dumb person, because I think it's pretty profound. There is something about the ending. We need this ending to be released, to say, oh, it's over. You can return to yourself. And that promise to say the story will have an end makes it more likely for us to engage with this, because it will return us to ourselves here. So we are more likely to engage with this, with the narrative, because it will get us back to ourselves. So if you see, I mean, in real life, another complete, not fiction example, if you see a picture of someone who is in a hospital bed, let's say, and then you put below the text saying, hey, this person is in chronically ill, it will get worse and worse. Or you show people the same picture and you say, this people suffers from an acute illness, in 3 weeks it will be over. How likely are you to visit this person? People are more likely to visit when they say it's acute, it will be over in a couple of weeks, than when they say, oh, it's getting worse and worse. That can mean more than one thing, but I would say, well, we are more likely to engage when we know it's short-lived. We are coming back to ourselves. It's not a full-time commitment. So the narrative resolution development is a trigger of empathy. Narratives, and there's Suzanne Keen has developed that, author of Empathy in the Novel. There is this narrative empathy form. And I would say the narrativity itself is a strong trigger of empathy. Let me skip that one, but let me get you one other one that I think is very powerful. I don't want to hold you hostage for the whole day here, so we have to move forward here. Here's another powerful trigger of empathy that will also set me up nicely for my dark sides, as you can imagine. Human beings are side takers. We love conflicts. We like to see, not necessarily our own, not all of us, hopefully not all of us like to fight. That's not what I mean. But when we see some tension between other people, that is exciting for us. It's interesting because human beings are, as an animal species, here different from apparently most other species. And we often take mentally a side, often very quickly. We celebrate this in sports. I mean, we'll watch sport things, even if we don't know the sport or the teams, we take a side and then the whole thing becomes exciting. And it becomes exciting because once we've taken a side, we see things through that perspective and see the other one as the adversary, the competitor, and maybe demonize them a little bit, take them less serious, or really hate them in some forms of conflict, and become more and more involved in our own perspective there. So the side taking, first of all, is a strong trigger of empathy. We take the side with the one and not the other one. And then you can imagine it may unfold consequences that are devious. And I'll come back to that in a little bit here. For now, just is enough to say that side taking is one of the strong triggers of empathy. Again, that is very powerful in fiction. where you have different perspectives offered for you. Fiction, of course, is still an interesting case because it also teaches us that we can have more than one perspective. Yes, drama, we get one perspective and then another one. And it trains us in that to say there's more than one. But a lot of the more dominant forms focus more on the one perspective over the others. In the end, there is a protagonist. The more modern form, drama is the older form in that sense, the more modern form of the novel focuses on a few perspectives. So it becomes the one and not the others, at least in many cases. I'm simplifying a little bit here. Okay, I mean, the soccer example, yeah, whichever team, this is of course for Christian, the German word for Christian here, die Schwalbe, the swallow, but in this case, it means the fake dive, is one of these many cases where people perceive the same scene completely differently from which side they have taken. Or the foul in sports, or the injury in sports, or the grandiose action. It's a nice case how differently people can perceive the same scene based on which side they've taken. I won't go into that here so much here. I think we can stop here to talk about, to say these are some of the empathy triggers. Literary works produce their own triggers. They train us to pay attention to certain things. Each of these triggers, we could say, are also attention getters. They throw us into a perspective and they do something. And they're individually different. We practice them individually differently. Cultures develop their own ways how to do this on a larger level. They emphasize certain ways how to do it, their narrative schemata. But then there's also very individual cases. I mean, the wonderful thing is that we get surprised. This can happen in ways we did not anticipate it for. And yeah, okay, I did not talk much about this, that this is very beneficial for the observer, not necessarily for the person you have empathy with. Maybe I'll come back to that. But from here, I want now to come to the dark sides of empathy that follow from this model here. And this is nicely short and nicely to the point. I can actually go through the list of at least a range of dark sides here. I will stop myself here at some point by just pointing that out, obviously, in a simple way here. The first one I actually mentioned directly. This is from the standpoint of the empathizer. The empathizer can experience self-loss. You empathize, you are held hostage to some degree in that process. That is a tendency of empathy. So empathy isn't just all good. It's a balancing act of allowing someone else, paying attention to someone else, allowing that person to kind of take over, and then your potential return. But there's limits where that happens, because we are moving ourselves out of our center of gravity. Even if we don't know who we are, we have no strong notion of self, suddenly it can be that somehow in a vague level, we have crossed the line. And the Stockholm syndrome is just one of many examples of this. A real life example to just hint at that are medical doctors who suffer from empathy burnout. So medical doctors in America, but also in several European countries, start slightly higher on empathy capacities, willingness to engage than other people, but very quickly during their studies, but then in the first 1-2 years of practicing medicine, they lose it. A third of them become basically empathy dead, complete burnout. And that seems to be that they just they get drawn into so many other situations from other people that tend to be, of course, on the negative side, that it's very hard for them to deal with that. And another thought is really challenged. So this is a hard part of it. It's partly also the speed of it, that they move from one patient to the other and stuff like that and so on, but one should not underestimate the effects of that. And that's, of course, bad for the patients too, because patients are more willing to listen to doctors who they perceive as having empathy. There's obviously positive sides too to this, that by experience self-loss, you also, you're going beyond yourself. There's a positive side that I'm not stressing here, but I just want to mention it briefly here. Okay, second dark side, and I can move quickly here because this one I also have already mentioned. This is what I call polarization of conflicts. I mentioned that this side-taking dynamic. Again, I love to drool a little bit about this, so and you don't have to understand this right now. What I want to stress here is that quick side-taking, spontaneous side-taking. I like this person, or in this conflict, maybe she's right. Leads to perspective taking, leading to empathy, sharing feelings with that side, then demonizing the other side, which leads to enforcing the side taking. So it becomes a self-enforcing circle. And that can be good in some cases, of course, because if one chooses the right side, then maybe it's justified, but it can also polarize the situation and lead to very strong effects that are highly negative, where we evilize the other side and beautify the own side. That means that empathy in these cases radicalizes conflicts. Empathy that is often meant to kind of set, oh, understand the other side, is often warped back in some way to always lead back to the single side. I do have a lot of examples and case studies for that. I'll skip them over. I mean, people try to use empathy in Northern Ireland and notice that their empathy intervention backfired. Once people thought that with empathy, you can lead people to understand, the Catholics can understand the Protestants can understand the Catholics, and so on. Ultimately, they warped it back and kind of only said to use it to even that information of the suffering of the other side, enforce their own side even more, and people became more polarized after an empathy intervention than before. That is one of many examples. I mean, I believe that even terrorism can be caused by empathy, not the lack of empathy, but one-sided identification with their own side. Seeing your side being suppressed by some majority is a strong stimulus of action. And I leave it at these kind of short things. Donald Trump uses that too. Also, he used to stylize himself as the one against the many, where you always win if you're the one against the flood of the Mexican immigrants, the swamp in Washington, the horrible feminists, and so on and so on and so on. He was very good at that kind of thing. That were, when you offer two sides, people can choose. Not everyone chose him, of course, but at the same time, it was enough for quite a while. I won't go over this very carefully here. I've already indicated that to you. Now, 3 more dark sides. One is one that people always bring up when I talk about empathy being not just all good. Then people at some point will always tell me, yeah, Fritz, okay, I see this point, and maybe the side taking, there's something about it. Other than Christian, everyone kind of says, okay, maybe he's right. Christian doesn't buy that part of the argument, the side taking one. So just to warn people here, there's controversy out here. But then at some point, people will always say, yeah, but empathy is still overall good because it leads us to help other people. We recognize people in need and we help them. And I would say it's not wrong. Empathy indeed gives us a powerful motivation to connect with other people and to help them. And that's true. I actually sign that. As in general, I say empathy is more good than bad. But I think if you look at it more fine-tuned, the dynamic is a little bit more messy and not as clean as we would like to be. The starting point for this assumption is always to say that all we need for empathy, for this form of empathy, is that we need to see someone who is suffering. And when we see someone suffering, we will have empathy with them. We are drawn to them in some way to feel empathic care for them. We want to change their situation. That's all what is needed. That draws our attention. And I say, well, that's not all. We actually need more. The first thing is, when we see someone suffering, we want to see the story. We want to know, why are they suffering? How did they get into that situation? And most importantly, how can they get out of it? Is there a positive development possible? Is there an arch of development, a narrative or a temporal sequence where we see it can get better? Remember also my idea here about this trigger of empathy that comes with change. We are more likely to have empathy if we see that we can return to ourselves. We're more likely to engage with someone in need if we see like we can help them, they get better, and all is good, and we can return to ourselves. We're done with this part. So the first thing is we need to see this change thing, but even that is not enough. What I really think is that in many cases, people don't really directly empathize with the person who's suffering. Rather, they imagine to be the helper, or they see a real helper figure and identify with the helper, or they imagine themselves, project themselves as a helper figure who reaches out to the person in need, but who is kind of a hero. You can clap them on the shoulder. Supergirl is managing it again. Supergirl, yes, she has empathy. And so by identifying with Supergirl, we have some filtered form of empathy through her it's filtered towards this other person. But it's not the same thing. Empathy means to listen carefully, to pay attention to the other person, and to listen, not just to kind of jump in and helping. But that's kind of a mistake that I think many people make, that they mix up these positions here. It's not directly empathy. It's more like thinking that one is the helper. And this directs a lot of kind of attention. I mean, to say, okay, in pictures like this, where do we focus on? Who are we when we see pictures of helping someone? Are we the person in need and imagine how it feels like to have an illness? Or is it easier to relate to the helper, to imagine, oh yeah, this is a good person? And I think in many cases, the way of less resistance is the one to identify with the helper. So that's the general kind of claim here. So that's why I say that's not directly empathy, it's false empathy, this hero identification. Another famous case for this would be Schindler's List, where Schindler is offered as this wonderful helper figure that we can identify with and relate to and stuff like that. But the people in the concentration camps are basically, except Stern, one of the people there, remain not faceless, but they play a smaller role than, well, tall Schindler in this case here. We have empathy through this filtered figure that is offered to us for identifying with. This horrible picture of Alan Kurdi that started the refugee, it didn't start the refugee crisis, but it started a shift in public perception of that. 3 days later, 3 countries in Europe opened the borders to refugees. So this picture most likely played a huge role in it. And it's still, I mean, I see this picture and I can't look at this. I mean, I find this horrible, absolutely horrible. I mean, it's failed arrival between ocean and land, the colors of Mary, the figure of the advent, the arrival to. It's also between death and sleep. You kind of hope the boy is sleeping. And so when I see it, is this empathy? No, I see myself as an observer who wants to walk to the boy and tap him on the shoulder and hope he will jump up and was just sleeping or just playing or so, or can be rescued or so. So again, it's a different form of empathy. And Germany famously, of course, when Germany opened the border for the refugees, first it was a huge welcoming celebration, but then it backfired. And this hero identification is short-lived. It's not the same thing as sustained long-term empathy with other people. It's more like you want to be the hero, so you want to be praised for it. And if the others don't praise you quickly and they don't immediately get better, the refugees all become wonderful German citizens that learn the language and sustain the economy, it backfires. So the tricky thing of this false form of empathy is resentment. And that's exactly what we saw in Germany 3 months after opening the border already. The border is still open. I'm very proud of that. It's not quite as open as it was, but still refugees are still allowed to enter, but the mood has changed. Yeah, let's skip that one part here. Okay, the other 2 points I'll do in 2 minutes, so that we come 1 minute each I give myself, so that we can move to the discussion phase. There's another dark side of empathy, which I call vampiristic empathy, which means that we live via others, that one relates to people who live a more rich life, to enrich oneself in the process. This is something like, for example, helicopter parents. It's fans, it's stalkers who kind of hold someone else, hold close attention to it. And the case of the helicopter parents, I think, is very interesting here, because in many cases, I believe, that's my reading of that situation, is that the parents want to, in a way, relive the state of being young again. But a more successful youth sheltered from certain evils, not making bad experiences, doing well in school and so on, which of course is bad for the kids. It's one of these cases, feels great for the parents maybe to observe their kids that way, but it's really horrible for the kids to be robbed of being allowed to make their own mistakes. That's why I call this vampiristic empathy. The empathy here really sucks the life and independence out of the victims of empathy here. So it's really the victims of empathy. It's not the people who benefit from empathy in this case. The fifth dark side I call sadistic empathy. And this simple idea here is that there's some forms of behavior where people cause pain to others, or tolerate pain to others, or seek out places where pain to others happens, so that they can co-experience that, so that they can pity these people, so that they can understand the people who are suffering. Because once someone is suffering, you can say, oh, I know exactly how you feel. I understand, I can relate, you're feeling bad. I feel empathy, which means that empathy here is not a way to make the situation better. No, empathy is the goal. You seek out the suffering or produce it yourself in the worst case, so that you can feel empathy. And that's great. Oh, I feel so glad that I can feel your suffering. I suffer with you. That kind of situation. And that's an extreme, it can be extreme in the form of sadism, but it can also be everyday behavior of little people who tease you, or like the bureaucrat who doesn't, or the teacher kind of exposes a student knowing how they're feeling and not how this is going. It's also something that happens in literary texts. I just want to hint at that, where certain characters, and I point here in this case to the adultery novel in the 19th century from Madame Bovary to Effie Briest, which are very different, where nevertheless there is this thing about, yeah, having a female actor, female protagonist that we see as suffering and no one really understands them well, where that energizes the reader, because the reader, at least I would suggest, wants the situation to improve for these heroines, and therefore feels like they have a role to play. I mean, they champion this female who needs to be understood or needs to come out of that situation that they're in, needs to wake up in the case of Madame Bovary, but that doesn't happen. But then in a certain sense, the readers then can stay on that level, because that's the place, that is what activates them. That gives them a role to champion that woman, that female. It's the cases that I have are all female, that champions that female protagonist. But that means that also they have to kind of also hope for the continuation of that suffering. La Regenta, the Spanish text, is a key example of that, where you have 800 pages of suffering that never come to an end. And that's the only thing that gets the reader going and keeps the reader involved there until the very end, of course. So that, I would say, is in a way also a form of sadistic empathy, because the kind of, you feel empathy because you're engaged there. And in this case, it's used for an aesthetic effect. Okay. We're coming to the very quick overview here. So based on this model, this trigger model of empathy that I gave you, which really I mean to invite you to pay attention to what activates your attention to others in real life, in narratives, in artworks. What is that? Pay attention to that. There's lots of different triggers that I've not mentioned, and this is also not so well understood. In some cases it's understood, but in most cases I would say there's a lot of things for us still to learn. From there, I moved us to the dark sides of empathy. And again, not to say that empathy is bad. No, empathy is needed in the world. It's very important, but it does suffer from it. There's possibilities of failure. There's self-loss is a tendency potentially in it. And then the four other negative forms are effects of empathy, a polarization, this false empathy or hero identification, vampiristic empathy, I mean, this living vicariously, but thereby sucking out the life of others, and sadistic empathy. This should not lead us to, of course, be against empathy. That would be wrong. But it just shows us that empathy is, again, not flawless. There's nothing sometimes people ask me, what should we hope for? I mean, if not empathy, what is it? And I would always say it's a balance of things. It's not one thing. It's not rationality either. It's not ethics alone or some V feeling. It's combinations of things. Paying attention is ultimately, I would say, maybe the best thing we can do is paying attention. So at this point, I thank all of you for paying attention, and I'll end my slideshow.